Okay, year 11, hello, Miss Cole here. I'm going to quickly talk you through the main points of charge of the Light Brigade. So before we get into anything else, I think worth remembering a little bit of context about the writer Alfred Lord Tennyson. Remember, he was the poet laureate for the latter half of his life, and as such it was his duty to create poetry which marked events of national significance. And he wasn't just completely free to write whatever he wanted. He would have had to have been very careful not to offend the leadership and to make sure that he maintained sort of national pride and not offended anybody. So that put him in a little bit of a conundrum where it came to the Battle of Balaclava. Battle that took place during the Crimean War and was absolutely catastrophic, had those leaders who were quite controversial in that they had bought their way into the military, they hadn't earned their position, Lord Lucan, Lord Cardigan, Lord Raglan, and there was a miscommunication in the order they received, and they sent these 600 men, the Light Brigade, into a battle that they couldn't win against a very heavily armed Russian force. And that was reported in the Times as one of the earliest examples of war reporting, and Tennyson saw this and he noticed how the violence, the horror that the men must have faced was completely omitted, that the mistake that was made was referred to as just a blunder, and he thought it was wrong and that actually these men should be called to account, but obviously had to be very careful how he communicated that. And so he used his poem Charge of the Light Brigade, sort of a thinly veiled message to the world, I think, on his real feelings about that outcome. So if we're looking at the message, I think that he certainly wants to clarify that the Battle of Balaclava was a truly horrific event, and we should honour the brave men who fought, absolutely, and that runs through. But equally, he does want to expose the blunder that led to their death. And I think it shows that actually there are times that we should be questioning those in power. They are not always right. As I said, the men leading that battle were arguably not that qualified to be there. So we're going to first look at form, because the form is quite interesting in this poem. It is written in ballad form. So ballad is a form of lyrical poetry, and the purpose of that is to make it memorable. And so I think it's really clear that what Tennyson wanted to achieve was he wanted this poem to be recited, to be told, and for the word of it to be spread. Okay, a ballad will typically have quite a narrative structure. So it tells a story, it's easy to retell, it's easy to remember. You can see through his use of repetition how he's encouraged that. And equally there will be a refrain. So we've got the refrain here of 600 to make sure that we are remembering all the way through just how many men's lives were endangered by this mistake. And ultimately it is a cautionary tale. Okay, question the decisions of those who are leading us. We move on now to the structure. So I think one of the most interesting things you can comment on is the use of dactylic dimeter, which runs pretty much throughout the poem. So dactylic dimeter, remember, as I've separated here, is where you've got these lines with 6 syllables, okay? And the meter sort of, it's stressed, unstressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, unstressed. And that pretty much carries throughout. And that makes it really rhythmic. And that's intentional, because what Tennyson wants is for this poem to reflect the pace and the lack of hesitance of the men as they were given their order, and even though they knew it was a doomed mission, they carried on regardless. However, that dactylic dimeter is a falling rhythm where you've got 2 unstressed syllables after the stressed one, and that can show, you know, it almost creates a sort of a downbeat tone. It reminds us there is quite a sombre message at the heart of this, and reflects those men that were falling. Equally, you've got that someone had blundered, that really key line that breaks the meter it has not got 6 syllables, and it stands out. It stands out on the page anyway by the way that it is separated, but where it breaks the meter, it would stand out verbally as well when you're reciting the poem to keep us focused on that key message. Someone had blundered. That is what caused this entire event. Something else I could comment on in terms of structure is the caesura. There is a reasonable amount of caesura, but it's generally used at the end of lines. So where it occurs within lines, I think it's maybe worth thinking about the reason for that. And you've got an example here, following the battle. So then they rode back, comma, but not the 600. So I think that is quite deliberate. I think Tennyson wants us to pause at that moment as we reflect on how many of them are actually going to return and how catastrophic that battle had been. Okay, in terms of language then. So as I said, that key line that you're going to want to remember is someone had blundered. Blundered is the word taken directly from that Times article. And if we look at the word blundered, it implies a minor error, a bit of a slip up. Like, oh, sorry, no, slight mistake. It wasn't a blunder. It completely underestimated the catastrophic error of these men who were leading this battle. Okay, and it's what Tennyson wants us to focus on. Okay, outwardly it appears to be about their bravery and about honouring these men, because that's what would have been expected of him to produce. But it's not what he wants us to remember. He wants us to remember the blunder. And that actually links to the repetitive use of these sounds. Okay, don't know if you've heard of the phrase to is human. It means to make error. And there are words that have this sound all the way through: shattered, sundered, thundered, wondered. They've all got this sound, as if to remind us constantly that at the heart of this story is a huge error. Wondered, I think, as well, is an interesting one. You've got it up here, all the world wonders. So charging an army while all the world wondered. You could look at that word wondered in a bit more detail, because I think what it shows is that as they were charging this army, people were questioning why on earth were they even in that position. It seems obvious. Why would you go? Why would you go and face an army so huge and so prepared when you are so unprepared and the odds are against you? And then finally, I think really interesting to comment on into the valley of death, which then becomes into the mouth of hell. So into the valley of death, these are both metaphorical references. Into the valley of death comes from Psalm 23 in the Bible, and it sort of describes sort of that moment of your impending death. And it makes it seem like for the soldiers, death is inevitable, it is unavoidable, but they have sort of a peaceful acceptance of it. They know that God is with them and they are doing the right thing. So that word valley you can zoom into in a bit more detail, because it does suggest that death does surround them at this point. It is inevitable, it is inescapable. But the overwhelming thing at that point is peace. However, once they arrive in battle, it is no longer a valley of death. It is the jaws of death. It is the mouth of hell. And that is to suggest that death is far more terrifying than they had anticipated, far more horrific, and it is quite godless. So we've gone from this biblical reference to a reference to hell. There is no sense of God in their dying moment. They've been led into the worst possible scenario. Okay, so in terms of the links that you might want to make, I think there's absolutely loads. Some a little more tenuous than others, but I think this is a really great poem in terms of linking. So you've got Ozymandias exposing the shortcomings of leadership. London, you can look at the criticism of institutionalised power, both written at very similar time with quite similar feelings about leadership. The war poetry, I think there's loads of connections. So exposure, bayonet charge, kamikaze. It's about exposing the reality of conflict and how men are often, I don't know why I said how men you led into danger, because you didn't lead them anyway. How men are led into danger, that should be. So how men are led into danger in these situations. Obviously bayonet charge, you've got a very obvious connection. You've got the word charge in both show how people were expected to just run into danger. Kamikaze is very similar. Obviously, those planes were expected to charge into the enemy. War photographer, I think, is an interesting link because it's about how the media was used to expose the truth of war and how unsuccessful it was in both instances. So in war photographer, there's that frustration that we've become utterly desensitized. In this, the reporting is so passive that it doesn't really tell the truth. It hides the errors of leadership to protect them. And then a bit of a tenuous link, but you got Emigre. I think you could look at the memories of war. They seem pretty inaccurate in both. So Tennyson is frustrated that people's knowledge of the war will be affected by what I think he probably deems slightly irresponsible journalism. In the Emigre, obviously, her memories of war are affected by her age, and her knowledge of her country is really only through the media. So a slightly more difficult link to make, but I think there's a link there if Emigre came up and you wanted to use this as a comparison.